Hi, welcome back to Sound and Voltage. I'm Jeff. Today I'm going to continue my DIY odyssey with a common and pretty necessary bit of kit, an envelope generator, or more specifically an ADSR. I'm going to do another video right away on ADSRs and how to use them, but this video is really me building one and giving a little advice, no matter how little I should, to people thinking about building one themselves. A lot of what I'm going to say here isn't really specific to ADSRs or this particular build, except for the testing at the end. So if you're just getting started DIYing modules and you're looking for some hard-won tips and tricks, this might be for you. Once again, I'm just going to reiterate that I'm not sponsored by AI Synthesis. I paid for all these myself. I just think they're pretty good modules for demonstrating basic functionality, and the new black panels are pretty sweet. Now, as opposed to my recent video about small Eurorack mixers, I'm not going to spend a lot of time looking at the schematics, except at the end when I add my own mod to the module. So instead I'm going to concentrate on how I build and test these modules and some tricks I've learned along the way. This shouldn't be taken as a replacement for AI's excellent build guides. I deviate from it some, but not materially. Okay, let's get started. First up, the resistors. I just spent several hours getting mine all back in order and organized, so here they are, all ordered by value, and when I was planning for this I printed out a list of everything I'd need, in order. So now it's easy for me to just go down the list and pull out the little packets with the values that I need. Oh, and it's always quite satisfying to snap the PCBs apart like this. I'm not going to make you sit through the soldering of a couple dozen resistors, so I'll fast forward through most of this. Also, my hair gets in the way of a lot of it. First thing, I'm going to use a multimeter to test the values of the resistors. Now, they are labeled, but sometimes I put the wrong value in the bag, or sometimes I buy them and they're just labeled wrong, or sometimes they're just way out of whack. It's easier to test them now and to be sure than to debug things later. Now, it's right here at the beginning where I start to go against the build docs. First of all, there's a resistor associated with the LED that controls the brightness. The docs say it's a 100 ohm resistor, but when I built the first one of these, I found that it was way too dim, and I ended up replacing it with a 10 ohm resistor, and it looked great. Something to remember is that different LEDs have different brightnesses. There'll always be a resistor nearby to manage that, and you may need to change the value depending on the LED. The problem is I only had two 10 ohm resistors left, and I needed two of them up around the power connector. So instead I'm replacing those ones around the power connector with 9.1 ohm resistors. Now these resistors mostly act as fuses to burn out in case you plug in the power backwards. And actually AI suggests that you should use diodes now. But in any case, the difference between 10 ohms and 9.1 ohms for this purpose really doesn't matter too much. So I'll use the 9.1s here and the 10 ohm resistor by the LED. I'm also going to be mucking with the value of a resistor at the end too. Sometimes you've got a lot of flexibility in the resistor values, sometimes you don't. In time you start to learn which ones you can fudge and which are important. So this is sort of my pattern here. I put in one value at a time, and I bend back one of the leads to hold it in place. And I do that until I've got, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 resistors in place before I solder them down. You don't want to get too many because it ends up with a little forest of leads sticking up, but somewhere in the 5 to 10 range works. Unfortunately, most of the footage of me soldering is just video of my hair, sigh. But it is mostly just basic soldering tasks, and there's a lot of YouTube videos that'll teach you that better than I can. If for some reason you really want to see me do the demo, I'll work on better overhead camera technique. So I think this bit is hair-free enough to point out my soldering technique. You might notice that I'm actually reaching under the board with one finger to push the resistor up and seat it nicely against the board before I solder it. Do I burn the tip of my finger? Oh yeah, but you get used to it. Then I take the board, flip it over, make sure I'm happy with what I see before I solder the other lead. Alright, back to some high-speed resistor soldering. So now here at the end of the resistors, I make another command decision to change the value of a resistor. The bill of materials, or BOM, calls for a 5.1 mega ohm resistor, and I was 100% sure that I had some of those, but I don't. But a cool thing about resistors is that you can add them together. And in a previous build of this module, I actually bodged together a 4.7 mega ohm resistor and a 470 k ohm resistor and soldered them together to form one that was 5.1 ohms. It was a bit gross with two resistors standing up and soldered together, so I decided that I'm just going to go with a 4.7 mega ohm resistor at the end and see if everything works. Turns out that it did. Next up are these 4148 diodes. There's 10 of them, and working with them is almost exactly the same as the resistors, except they need to go in a specific direction because they keep electricity from going back in the other direction. It's pretty easy. The diode has a little black stripe on it, and the PCB markings have a little stripe on it, and you just line them up. Now, if this were running at slower speed, you'd see that I'm double and triple checking everything. It's always easier to get it right in the first place than to have to fix it later. Now come the sockets for the ICs. You want to do these early on because they're way easy to get them in before anything taller than that is soldered down. That's a general rule to building modules: start low and work up. The only thing I really have to watch for here is that there's a little notch at one end of the socket, and you want that to line up with the marking on the PCB. It doesn't affect putting the IC in, it'll fit either way, but it is a visual indicator of which way it should go in. So I just hold them in place, I flip the board over and lay it flat against the table. And then I solder one leg down. And I flip it over to make sure everything's seated flat. If it's not, you can just press up on the socket and touch the soldering iron to that single leg, and you'll feel the socket sort of snap into place. Once it's there, then I go through and I solder in the rest of the legs. Next up are some ceramic capacitors. These are easy and about the same as resistors, except they wiggle around a bit more. At this point, I'm going to put down my power connector. There's two ways you can go here. If you have enough room to put down a keyed or shrouded connector, you can go ahead and do that. But at this point, I don't really bother. I just use pin headers, 2x5. These headers come as long strips of 40 pins, but you can break them off to whatever size you need. I just use a pair of pliers to hold it. I move it to about the size that I want and then snap it off. Sometimes you end up with one less or one more pair of pins than you need, and it's a little wasteful, but these are cheap. And now you can see that I'm putting the board down, but leaving one side of it elevated against the pad that I'm using here. That's so that the pins are straight up and down. And as usual, I solder one pin, check to make sure that everything's even, and then solder the rest. Next up are the electrolytic capacitors. There are almost always two of these right around the power connector for the module. They're polarized, and so they need to be put in the right way. But it's easy to spot because the capacitors have a stripe down one side that's labeled negative. Also, one lead is shorter, and that's going to be the negative side. These are pretty easy to solder, they just have a tendency to want to tip to one side. So you can see here that, like I often do, I solder one leg, and then I hold it and press it up with one finger while I reflow the solder to let it settle, and then I solder the other leg. This module has a third one of those capacitors, and it's a little bit trickier because it won't fit standing up when you put the panel on it. So we bend the leads 90 degrees and then install it lying flat down on the board. You may have to do that sometimes with modules. Sometimes resistors have to be put in standing up. Sometimes capacitors have to be lying down because of space constraints, but you get used to doing it. Then there's one transistor, and you have to install it the right way around, but it's pretty easy because it's rounded on one side and flat on the other, and the shape on the PCB is the same, so you just match them up. So at this point, all of the simple stuff is done, and we're going to look now at the hardware and the assembly. But first, there's a little trick I've been using to make sure that I get good, clean solder joints everywhere. First, I go looking for any places where I've left a little bit of lead sticking up, and I trim those down. Then I take a flux pen and I dab it on all the solder joints, all of them. The flux is what helps everything melt together nicely. You don't have to use a pen, it's just convenient. But then, when everything is all fluxed up, I just go through and I touch the soldering iron to each and every point in turn. This is going to reflow the solder, and the flux is going to make it all melt together nicely, and you don't have to worry about cold solder joints and things. And if you do it with a fairly dry soldering iron, it'll actually wick away some of the larger globs of solder if you use too much, and deposit it onto spots where you didn't use quite enough. A flux pen is maybe $10–20 and it lasts for a long while. And this process only takes a couple of minutes. The results are absolutely worth it, and I guarantee that if you're unhappy with your soldering, this one trick is going to level up the end result. Any module that you build that has multiple PCBs like this, you're going to need to join them together somehow, so let's do that. Now the module has two places where they're going to connect. One of them has 6 pins and one of them has 8, and these are just standard headers. I've got a box full of them of different sizes from things that I've built in the past. The male side, the pins, just come in these strips, and all you have to do is put the pins into the female connector and snap the strip of pins right at that point, and they come out perfectly every time. So now I've got these headers with, the pins on both sides, and I need to solder them into place on both boards. They can wiggle back and forth and the pins can fall out easy. I solve this problem with the cunning use of a rubber band. What I do is I get everything into place and then I just wrap the rubber band loosely around it, just enough to keep everything in place. This next part is a bit optional, and I never used to do it, but I've changed my mind about it recently. Many of the PCBs have little holes in them, and that's where you can put standoffs and screw the boards together. Without them, the boards can be pulled apart accidentally, and that's happened to me a few times. But also, when you're soldering these headers together, the boards can end up slightly uneven, and by putting the standoffs in place now, it locks everything nice in place for soldering. Okay, and now we can start putting on the hardware, and by that I mean things like potentiometers, jacks, switches, LEDs, basically the user interface. A common mistake made by new builders is to put everything together, solder it, and then discover that the front panel doesn't fit. So I'll show you what I do. I'm going to start with the pots and the jacks. It's pretty easy. There's only 4 potentiometers and 3 jacks. The pots can be a tiny bit finicky because they have 3 pins, but then these 2 legs for support, and they clamp into the bigger holes for stability, and sometimes you end up fighting with those. In this case, it all went pretty well. And then the jacks just go into place beside them. Now before I solder anything, I put the panel on and I make sure that all of the pots and jacks fit like they should. I use a couple of nuts. You don't have to do all of them, but I use a couple of nuts to fasten it all together and hold things in place. And then I solder it now that it's set, and everything will come out nice and even and I don't have to worry about it. Next up are the switches. There's this one big chunky toggle switch and then a momentary switch button that we'll use to launch the envelope manually. And finally, there's one LED. The easiest thing to do with LEDs is just to leave them a little loose, put the faceplate on, and then push the LED into place. Of course, this time it's giving me problems, so I'm going to leave it for now. When you solder these switches into place, you need to use a fair bit more solder, so be generous with it. So yeah, this LED. This LED is going to cause me problems. At first it seemed like maybe it was too big to go through the hole in the front panel, but that wasn't it. So I put it all back together and wiggled it around a bit, and it got seated properly, and then I soldered it in place. And at this point, basically I have a completed module, but we're not done yet. First thing, I'm going to do the dab of solder pass on the second PCB. You want to be careful around the headers here, that plastic melts really easily. And now I'm going to clean up the boards. The flux can be conductive, and there's a lot of it on the boards now. I use this 99.9% isopropyl alcohol. I just pour a little bit of it into a shot glass that I keep nearby, and then use a toothbrush, and I give everything a good scrub. And then I just use paper towel to dab at it and pick up the alcohol and the now dissolved flux. Later on, I'm going to wash the PCBs properly and run water over it to clean it, but this is fine for now. And I almost forgot the ICs to go into these sockets. I get out my little box of op amps. The one that this build uses, and they're quite common, are the TL072 and TL074. They're really cheap, so I buy them 10 or 20 at a time and I keep them around. So a couple of points about putting ICs into sockets. The first is that these legs on the ICs are usually set just a little bit wider than the holes in the socket are, and you can end up fighting with that and bending the legs. So what I do is I use a pair of needle nose pliers. I get the whole row together and I bend them inwards just like a millimeter or two towards the middle. Then I do the other side. Once that's done, they usually go in pretty easily. Be sure to check before you give them a good push down, because you can bend those legs into pretty horrible shape and ruin the chip if it's not lined up right. The other thing you really want to watch out for is that you put them in the right orientation. In this case, the 074 has a U-shaped marking on it, and that matches up with the U-shaped notch on the socket and then on the PCB. But the 072 actually has two markings, and it's not actually the U-shaped one that goes in that direction, but the side with the little dot. You learn what to watch for, and in this case, for instance, the text on the top of both chips goes in the same direction. The final step before actually plugging things in to see if they work is to do a continuity test. I joke that this is the "is it going to blow up" test, because this is testing whether or not there's a short between positive, negative, and ground. Pretty much any multimeter is going to have this feature. When 2 points are connected, it's going to make a buzz or a beep, and if you're not familiar with how Eurorack power works, I'll have a link to a video I made about it in the description. The short version is that the 10 pins on this power connector, 2 of them are connected to -12, 2 on the other end are connected to +12, and the 6 in the middle are all ground. So my process is first to touch the 2 pins on one end, and it should beep, and then I walk one of the test leads down the other pins, it should be silent, and then when it's at the other end, I bring the other test lead down and touch it, and it should beep, and then I walk it up and test things in the middle. And if that all works, you're ready to test it. So here's my test rack. I'm going to be using the Mordax data to look at the output of the module, and I've got Pam's new workout here to providing an incoming gate to test with. I start it up, plug it into the output on the Mordax, and you can see that the envelope is already running since the module is in LFO or loop mode. And I hit the button, but look, that darned LED isn't lighting up. I even turn off the light just to see if it's super dim, but it seems like it's just broken. And I had doubled and triple checked that LED to make sure it was in the right orientation, and I check it again here, and it was right. So it was just a dud, and I'm going to have to replace it. So everything has to come back apart. That's one thing about building modules, you get used to taking them apart and putting them back together. Now we're at the point of desoldering that LED. This is something that used to fill me with dread, and I'm still not great at it. I'm cutting out a few of my failed attempts here because, honestly, I was being a little stupid about it, but also you mostly just got a lot of my hair in the shots. I really need to work on better camera positioning. And now I'm just heating up the solder joints and wiggling the LED free. It's always nice to have an assortment of LEDs around, but I keep discovering that I don't have the one that I really want. But I dig around and I eventually find one that's right. So I'm back to clearing out the solder in the holes. I'm using some soldering braid here, which is just braided copper, and when you put it down on top of the solder and heat them both up, it'll wick the solder away from the board and up into the braid. It works best if you give the solder a dab of flux and then put some on the soldering braid as well, but once you do, it can clear it right out. Finally, I can put the new LED in place and solder it down. And now I'm ready to test it again. And I'm confused briefly by the fact there's nothing on the oscilloscope. It turns out that in order to see anything, you actually have to plug it in. Sigh. But yeah, now you can see that the LED lights up on the ADSR, so my replacement worked. Huzzah! Alright, so at this point, I want you to notice that when I press down the button and hold it and then release, sometimes the envelope will relaunch. That's called bounce, and it's not really what I want when I press a button like this, but there's a pretty easy fix, and I'm going to get to that in a moment. Here, now, notice that when I press the button, the attack stage fires, it goes up, and then decay, and it comes down, and it hits the sustain level, and then it just stays at sustain. That's hardly what I expect, and you'd think it would go back down to 0. I mean, this is an ADSR, not an ADS and stay at S. And this drove me nuts when I built the first one of these. I spent a bunch of time debugging it, and then I annoyed the manufacturer about it, and then finally I read the documentation, and this weirdly is the expected behavior. When you do the manual launch like this, it's just an AD envelope, just the attack and decay, and then it settles and remains at sustain. There are a few different modes that this module can operate in, and in this mode, this is the expected behavior. If you turn the sustain down, it drops right down to 0. Wacky. Not what I expected, but now that I know that it works this way, I can figure out uses for this behavior. Now I'm plugging it into PAMS, and I'm giving it a slow clock that stays high for a while, and it gives me a good chance to look at the attack, decay, sustain, and release. Everything looks good. And at this point, the module is officially finished. But I'm back a little bit later now, and I want to tackle that debounce fix that I mentioned. It's surprisingly easy, and I guess I'm honestly a bit surprised that it's not just part of the design. I forget where I read about it, it was a while back, but it turns out that if you place a small capacitor between the switch and the resistor that comes after it, it acts to filter out that double hit. So that's what I'm going to do here. I have a little 0.01 microfarad capacitor, and I'm just going to trim the legs off. You get a great shot of my hair again. So here's the after picture. You can see that I've just soldered it right down on the back of the board, lying flat between those 2 points. So I reassemble it, and now it's time to test. I get out the test rack and fire it up, but that's weird. It's pinned high, and when I press the button, nothing happens, and oh man, what did I do? So I take it out and I look, and right here, you can see that the boards aren't lined up. I actually inserted the pins off to one side. I often find that I kind of rush through things at the end. I do it with videos too. You get excited about finishing and just want to get it done. But there's a lesson here about double checking everything. So I move the thing over, plug it in, and thankfully it's all still working. And more than that, if I press and hold that button and release it, I no longer get that double launch, so my debounce fix worked. And that's it. The module is complete, or at least it's electronically complete. I'm still going to want to get it all properly assembled, put the standoffs in, find appropriate knobs for the potentiometers, etc. Here we are at the end, with 2 freshly minted ADSRs to add to my growing AI synthesis rack. But that wraps it up for this video. If for some reason you've got to this point, maybe consider subscribing, it really helps the channel, and apparently you're a little crazy. Thanks.